sure. Yeah, they're upstairs. You want to go see them? Sure. You want to go mic them up? Yeah, they're in that room. Yeah, up on the second floor. We do something in the theater, and then I'll be right there. Okay. I'll have them down here. We'll just see how the crowd goes for probably 10 minutes. So, right in. I'll be up there before. Okay. Yeah. You okay with that, Sean? Yeah, I was just looking at it. I was thinking maybe here too. How are you? I'm good. How are you? How are we doing? How are you?
1, 2, 1, 2.
That's not my phone. We're both bad. Both bad days. I was grateful. Not tonight. Let me go up there. I'm going to do the introduction. I'm going to sit here, but Bob Bixby. There are 4 more. What is it? One trick is you got to remember, you got to look at the light, you have to go through it, you have to press the button on the top one, press it on. Turn green. Got it. I'm going to, is that live? Yeah. Just for I'm going to tell them. No.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our program momentarily, but I just thought I'd let you know we have plenty of seating left over here to my right, to your left, and there's also a few prime seats right here on the front row if you're brave enough. Thanks.
Robert, David, Brian, Isabel, Robert, David, Brian.
Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the University of Denver. I'm Richard Caldwell, and I'm the director of the graduate and undergraduate programs in public policy at the university and director of the Institute for Public Policy Studies. And we are absolutely thrilled to have all of you here tonight. The most important thing is that I want to thank the Concord Coalition for making this event possible, the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour. And some of you probably are already aware that we had an absolutely fabulous day today, all day, of various presentations and lectures, including one from our guest this evening to teach our students all about what is happening in terms of fiscal policy and to alert them to the many dangers that lurk in our economy and in our society with respect to debt and deficit. In just a second, we're going to be introducing our honored guest, David Walker. Before we do that, we are joined, we're thrilled to be joined by three folks from today, each of whom is a very distinguished analyst and expert in fiscal policy. We have Bob Bixby, who is Executive Director of the Concord Coalition. Bob, welcome. We're so glad to have you. We have Isabel Sawhill, who is with the Brookings Institution after many years of very, very distinguished service in budgetary capacities with the American government, one of our country's absolutely premier fiscal experts. And then we have Brian Riedl, who is with the Heritage Foundation and one of the rising superstars in budget analytics. Let's put it that way. David Walker is one of the most important Americans currently active in public policy, without any question. He has ventured forth to tell the story of our fiscal dilemmas in incredibly powerful ways. And we are deeply honored to have you, sir, with us this evening. But to tell you more about our program and to help moderate it, I'm going to turn things right over to Bob Bixby, and we will proceed. So welcome, everybody. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you, Dean Caldwell, and I want to thank the University of Denver for hosting us today and bringing attention to this issue, particularly among the students here, because one of the messages of the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour is that this is an issue that primarily will affect future generations, and so it's something that we really want to get students involved in. The message we bring today is perhaps not a cheerful one. But it isn't all gloom and doom either. As a matter of fact, I would argue that we're actually the ultimate optimists, because as you look at some of the dire projections of current policy that we'll all show, we nevertheless feel that if the American people confront these issues and challenges honestly, we'll be able to find solutions. If we didn't think that, we wouldn't be doing this. So let me begin with a couple of, I'm going to just sort of set the stage with a couple of facts about the federal budget right now, and then others of my colleagues will expand upon those, and then we hope to get to a good Q&A session. A few days ago, the federal government closed the books on fiscal year 2009, and we ended up with a budget deficit of $1.4 trillion. By far and away, that was the biggest budget deficit that our country has ever run. In dollar terms, it's way off the charts. But if you look at it as a percentage of the economy, it's also quite large. Our prior post-World War II record budget deficit was 6% of the economy of GDP. That was in 1983. This year's budget deficit, 9.9% of GDP. So you can see we're really into uncharted territories, but that's really not the worst news. The worst news is that we were already on an unsustainable track with our fiscal policies before this recession hit and contributed to the very large budget deficits that we see in the short term. So there are forces at work that we're going to be talking about tonight that have had us on the road doing a fiscal wake-up tour well before we had a budget, a recession contributing to the big budget deficit. And let me talk about some of those factors. Okay, first slide. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid already take up about 42% of the so-called non-emergency budget if you get rid of the TARP and those sort of one-time things that have happened this year. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid already take up over 40% of the federal budget, and the baby boomers are just on the verge of retirement. Keep those big three programs in mind. Now, what are the factors that go into those? Well, one of them is demographics. Over the next 25 years or so, the percentage of the population aged 65 and over is going to go from about 13% where it is today to around 20%. And that alone will have a big impact on the cost of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. But demographics is not the only factor at play here. You've heard a lot this year about bending the cost curve in health care. Well, there's a reason for that. Healthcare costs have been growing faster than the economy for some time, and if they continue at the same pace, you'd find just two programs, Medicare and Medicaid, would consume as much of our nation's economy as the entire federal budget does today. So we truly do have to find a way to control rising healthcare costs in order to keep the budget, or put the budget on some sort of a sustainable trend. Now, others will talk a little bit about the future. If we just drop back and look at this year's budget, this was a projection before the final figures came out. So it shows a budget deficit of $1.6 trillion. So what passes for good news in Washington these days is that the final figures came in at $1.4 trillion instead of $1.6 trillion. I don't feel real good about that as like moving in the right direction. But anyway, that's why that slide is a little bit different. But what I wanted to bring your attention really is the top of the spending column, which is net interest. We're all going to talk a little bit about that, I think, but it's really important. That's the money that we spend on the national credit card. That's our interest cost. $177 billion or thereabouts. That's about what we spent on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, I mean, it is a large sum of money, and it's the price of running big budget deficits. And if you think about what may happen going forward, if you continue to run big budget deficits, you're going to continue to run interest costs. And remember, we're borrowing a great deal of money at very low interest rates right now. When we have to roll that over at higher interest rates, that interest cost is going to go up. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that we tend to spend at about, the federal government tends to spend at about 20% of GDP, a little bit higher, and tax at about 18% of GDP, or the economy. Think of it just as though that's been sort of a traditional range, and it's important when we think about the projections for the future of where spending and revenues are going to be to keep that frame of reference in mind. You can see in this chart here, the problem is that even when we get through these incredibly high budget deficits the next couple of years, it's not like we get back to a balanced budget or anywhere close to it. Even when the economy recovers, we're on a track to run historically or unusually large budget deficits. Now, if you run big budget deficits, you have to borrow money. Where do we get all that money? Increasingly, we've been borrowing from abroad because Americans haven't done a great job of saving, and we're having to borrow a huge sum of money. So now, a little over half of the privately owned debt in the United States, government-owned debt, is held by foreign investors. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does present a certain vulnerability, and it does act as as a growing mortgage on future national income. I mentioned interest before. that interest cost just over the next 10 years could rise substantially. This is a projection that the Congressional Budget Office did of the president's budget, and you see interest costs rising to about $800 billion just within the 10-year budget window. That would be more than we spend on defense by that time. A very large sum of money indeed. So we have to act now. The message of the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour, again, this is Paul Revere. I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, so I like to show pictures of Paul Revere. But I also like to emphasize that what we're trying to do is spread an alarm. We're not preaching gloom and doom. We agree on several key points. Now, we come from different perspectives here on the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour. We have different ideas of the ideal level of spending, taxes, and debt. But we all agree that fiscal policy is unsustainable. This is a matter of arithmetic, not ideology. We agree that there are no easy solutions like cutting waste, fraud, and abuse or thinking that we'll grow our way out of it. We think that we're going to have bipartisan solutions and a willingness to consider all options. There shouldn't be preconditions about considering solutions. Public engagement is vital to this. That's why we're out here doing this. People need to know about these issues, need to have a say in the solutions. And finally, even though we bludgeon people to death with these numbers in our charts, it's really a moral issue. It's not just about numbers, it's about the legacy that we're leaving to future generations. Now, when Richard was introducing Dave Walker, he left out something that I want to tell you about. Dave has been described by the Washington Post as the rock star of the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour. And that is very high praise indeed for the nation's chief accountant. I give you our next speaker, David Walker.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Dean Caldwell. It's a pleasure to be back in Denver, although I'm taking the red eye back to New York tonight, so not exactly the way to come to Denver, and hopefully next time I'll stay a little bit longer. I'm joining my colleagues tonight. Each of us is going to give you an 8-minute overview, and then we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. And so my job is to talk to you about where we've been, where we are, where we're headed, and to help you believe, and as I believe, that this is not hopeless. There is a way forward. In the last 40 years, the composition of the federal budget has changed dramatically. 40 years ago, 46% of the federal budget was for defense. Last year, 21% of the federal budget was for defense, and that counts Iraq and Afghanistan. 40 years ago, Medicare and Medicaid represented 4% of the budget because they came into existence in 1965. Last year, they represented 20% of the budget and growing dramatically. 40 years ago, 6% of the federal budget was for interest. Last year, 8%. But hold on, because we're adding debt at record rates, and interest rates are very low now by historical standards, and they will go up when the economy turns around. The only question is how much. Another dimension is that 40 years ago, when our elected representatives came to Washington, D.C., they got to decide how 2/3 of the federal budget would be spent. So only 1/3 of it was on autopilot, so-called mandatory spending. Last year, only 39% of the federal budget was decided by the Congress. The rest was predetermined based upon interest on the debt and entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, civilian and military pensions, retiree health care, agricultural subsidies, etc. That cannot continue. Believe it or not, of the 39% of the federal budget that is on autopilot, that includes every express and enumerated responsibility envisioned by the Founding Fathers under the Constitution. Every single one. And yet they are getting squeezed because so much of the budget is on autopilot. At the end of 2008, which is the last set of audited financial statements, the United States was in a $56.4 trillion hole. That's the total of all liabilities and unfunded promises for Social Security and Medicare alone. That was up from $20.4 trillion at the beginning of George W. Bush's administration. The numbers aren't out yet for 2009, but I'm going to estimate that they're going to be about $63 trillion. Now let's put that in perspective. $63 trillion is $10 trillion more than every American is worth, including Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and every other billionaire in this country. And the gap is growing. But the $56.4 trillion is $184,000 per person, $483,000 per household. Believe it or not, median income in the United States, median household income is less than $50,000 a year. So that means that the typical American family, if we go our do nothing, let it ride, don't make tough choices approach, has an implicit second or third mortgage equal to about 9 times their annual household income, but no house to back the mortgage. This is what our fiscal future looks like. The line represents revenues as a percentage of the economy, assuming that we continue to tax at about historical levels of about 18.3% of the economy. The bars represent spending as a percentage of the economy, so inflation's taken out. If the bar's above the line, that's a deficit. There are no surplus years here, so I don't need to talk about that. And you can see that it gets progressively worse. And in fact, the fastest growing expense is interest on the debt. And by the way, this doesn't assume a rise in interest rates. In fact, the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, the agency that I headed for 10 years, came out recently within the last few weeks with their new long-range budget simulation. And it shows that under the alternative scenario, which is a more realistic scenario, that the single largest line item in the federal budget within 12 years will be interest on the federal debt. And what do you get for that? As we say in the South, shinola, nothing. Okay? This is the problem. This is debt as a percentage of the economy from 1800 to 2050. That is a tsunami of spending and debt that could swamp our ship of state. The problem is not the past. The problem is not the present. The problem is where we're headed. And yes, increasingly America is being mortgaged, and increasingly that mortgage is held by Americans. At the end of World War II, no foreign debt. Now it's over 50%. This is a little bit dated and increasing. Why? Because we don't save enough in this country. We're great at spending, but not great at saving. Yes, we can put our house back in order, but to do so, we're going to have to impose tough statutory budget controls, tougher than the ones that we had under Bush 41 and Clinton, because our situation is worse, and the tsunami of spending is closer to hitting our shores. Yes, we can reform Social Security to make it solvent, sustainable, secure, and more savings-oriented. It's really not that tough if we go about it the right way. We must control health care costs, because they could bankrupt our country if we don't. And yes, we should move to try to assure some level of universal coverage that's appropriate, affordable, and sustainable, improve quality, enhance personal responsibility. But you cannot reduce health care costs by expanding coverage. That's an oxymoron. And we've already made $38 trillion more in promises for Medicare than we have the funds for. So we've got to be careful about trying to add a wing onto a house that's structurally unsound and mortgaged for more than it's worth. Yes, we need to reform our tax system to make it more understandable, more streamlined, equitable, and competitive, but to generate enough revenues to pay our bills and deliver on the promises we intend to keep. We need to reprioritize and rebaseline government. A lot of it's out of date, and frankly, a lot of it just flat doesn't work. Government measures things by how much money it expends and how much in tax preferences it gives out, not by what they accomplish. And quite frankly, in many cases, we're below average as compared to industrialized nation on results, including K through 12 education and healthcare outcomes. But it's going to take an extraordinary process, a new type of fiscal future commission that will engage the American people, set the table for a tough vote, because the regular order is broken. This is not just about numbers, it's about values. And the word I'll give you is stewardship. that each of us have a responsibility not just to generate positive results today, not just to leave things better off when we leave than when we came, but better positioned for the future. And my generation, the baby boom generation, is failing on its stewardship responsibilities. And last, it's also about people. And these are my 3 granddaughters. They're too young, and two granddaughters, 1 grandson. Sorry about that. Sorry, Danny. I'm going to be in trouble. But in any event, they are obviously too young to vote. Their future is being mortgaged. This is taxation without representation. It's irresponsible. It is immoral. And it is un-American. And it's got to stop. We're going to have a new version of IOUSA focusing on solutions, of a 30-minute version that will come out in January. And January 12, 2010, Come Back America, Solutions for America's Future. Thank you very much.
Hi there. Thanks for coming out tonight. My name is Brian Riedl. I'm with the Heritage Foundation. And I'm going to briefly summarize the entitlement problem that's driving our long-term deficits, and then show why there really is no easy answer and why entitlement reform is really the only way out. First, for a little context. This year, the federal government spent $32,000 per household. That's, again, let me repeat that. The federal government spent $32,000 for every household in America. That's up $7,000 in 1 year per household. Raise your hand if you got your money's worth. I never get a lot of hand raises. I provided this for context because people are usually very surprised that we spend $32,000 per household. The danger is that it's going to rise a lot higher than this before it drops down because of entitlement reforms. The problem begins with acknowledging that we have 77 million retiring baby boomers. When you combine that with longer lifespans, you see that the ratio of workers paying the benefits of each retiree is going to drop. In 1960, 5 workers paid the benefits of each retiree. Today, 3 workers pay the benefits of each retiree. By 2030, 2 workers will have to pay the benefits of each retiree. Now, what does a 2 to 1 ratio mean? Imagine a boy and a girl born today in 2009. In 2030, they marry and start a family. This couple will have to support themselves, their children, and the Social Security and Medicare benefits of their very own retiree. Every couple will have that burden just starting out. Now, in addition to the demographic tsunami we face, you also have the problem of rising healthcare costs, which makes Medicare a much bigger problem than Social Security. Kind of a 1-2 punch in there, demographics and rising healthcare. Medicaid is part of the equation too, because Medicaid will end up covering a lot of the long-term care and nursing home care that Medicare doesn't cover. So the cost of Medicaid is going to go up as well because of long-term care. So what does it mean? The cost of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security will go from 8.4% of GDP today to 18.6% of GDP by 2050. That's a 10% of GDP increase. Now, the GDP is the sum of all income produced and spent in America in a given year. So that means basically $1 out of every $5 spent in America by anyone will be by the government for these 3 programs. Now notice, the axis goes to 20% of GDP. That's about the historical average size of the federal government, 20% of GDP. So if these 3 programs are going up to 18.6% of GDP, there's not a lot of money for much else. Also, notice that the red area, Medicare, grows a lot faster and bigger than the blue area, Social Security. That's where, as I mentioned earlier, health inflation makes Medicare a much bigger problem than Social Security. So the red Medicaid wedge grows a lot faster and bigger than the blue Social Security wedge. Okay, what do we do about it? Option 1, raise taxes every year to cover that 10% of GDP cost increase. Well, if we commit to raising taxes every year, let's put this in today's dollars. 10% of the GDP is $12,000 per household. So you would have to raise taxes the equivalent today of $12,000 per household just to pay all the benefits that have been promised. Can you imagine a $12,000 per household tax hike permanently? I can't. And note, even if we repealed all of the Bush tax cuts for the poor and the rich, that gets you 1/10 of the way there. That's how much we'd have to raise taxes. In reality, we would have to more than double your marginal income tax rates. Your combined tax rates would have to go to European levels. And with that, you would probably have a slower economy, lower income, and fewer jobs. Simply put, we can't tax our way out of this. Okay, let's disregard this option. We don't want to raise taxes that high. Let's try spending cuts. There's a lot of waste in the federal budget. Let's cut other programs every year. Well, if we start cutting other programs to make room for the growth of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, by 2030, you will have eliminated every program except for defense. By 2049, you've closed down the Pentagon, meaning that the entire federal budget, 100% of it, would go for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the debt. There wouldn't be a nickel for defense, education, homeland security, veterans, anti-poverty programs, highways, nothing. Clearly, this is unimaginable, but that's the path we're on. All right, we can't tax our way out of it. We can't eliminate other programs to solve the problem. I guess we could just keep running budget deficits. The problem is, if you run a deficit to cover 10% of GDP every year, that's like adding another $1.5 trillion every year to the budget deficit. And that's holding everything constant. But really, if you borrow that much money, interest rates go up. But that makes the cost of borrowing go up, which means more debt, which means more interest rates, which means the net interest grows really fast and the economy collapses. All right, we can't tax our way out of it, we can't eliminate other programs by themselves to get out of it, and we can't run budget deficits. There's only one option left. Reform and modernize Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Reform is the only way to avoid the scenarios listed before, and every year of delay only pushes up the final reform costs. Now, reform may include putting programs on long-term budgets with caps. Help us better set priorities and make trade-offs. We could rein in programs costs by better targeting benefits to those truly in need and bringing in more choice and competition to programs like Medicare and Medicaid. But we do want to start now, because a lot of people say we don't want to affect anybody over the age of 50 because they're too close to retirement to adjust, and I think that's a fair point. But every year, 4 million baby boomers cross that threshold. By 2014, all baby boomers will be at age 50 or older. At that point, any sort of reform is going to have to pull the rug out from people close to retirement. So whatever we do, we don't want to wait. We want to reform now to give people time to adjust. I've thrown some numbers at you, but I want to sum up to say this is about more than economics. The question is whether one generation should hand a multi-trillion-dollar retirement bill over to the next generation. In the absence of fundamental reform, the next generation faces higher lifetime tax rates and lower incomes than their parents. And every year we wait, the cost goes up. But it doesn't have to be that way. This is the greatest single economic challenge of our era. But we have tackled depressions and world wars. We can surely tackle this too, but only if we roll up our sleeves and work together, old and young, Democrat and Republican, to make the hard but necessary decisions. Thank you.
Well, I hope everybody is convinced at this point that we have a problem, because we really do, and I think you've just been hearing how huge it is. So I really want to focus on what are some of the solutions. Dave Walker and others have already touched on them, but let's try to get into them just in a little more detail. My argument is going to be that given the problem that Brian just enumerated, we're going to need to do a little bit of everything. He explained why you couldn't do the whole job with just one thing. We are going to have to put both taxes on the table and spending cuts, and we're going to have a bipartisan effort to do that, and Republicans are going to have to accept the idea of higher revenues, and Democrats are going to have to accept the notion that we can cut entitlement programs, which means primarily benefits for the elderly. I look out and I see a lot of people out there who are younger than I am, but perhaps not all that young, and so we're talking about us. Let's start, though, with these big entitlement programs. Social Security reform is absolutely essential. I hope that by next year we will be talking about it again. What we need to do is by now well known and almost universally agreed to amongst those who study the problem. The list of items on this slide are all of the options that have been much discussed in Washington. The problem is not that we don't know what to do and how to solve the problem. The problem is political. We haven't been willing to do it. My view is we need to do some of all of the things that are on this slide. What about health care reform? Health care is the big enchilada. It's even a bigger problem than Social Security because, as the previous panelists have shown you, when you project out, it is rising health care costs per capita that are really causing both federal budgets, state budgets, household budgets, and even businesses to face a very uncertain and difficult future. So the Congress right now, of course, is discussing some major reforms. They are mainly discussing expanding coverage so that more people can have access to health care. We're the only industrialized country that doesn't provide all of their citizens at least some basic access to health care. So in my view, it was time that we did this, that we provided access to a basic package to all and subsidies to those who otherwise couldn't afford it. But as others have said, that is going to add to costs. And so how are we going to pay for those additional costs? There's a big debate going on in Washington right now about how to pay for health care reform. And I've shown the offsets on this chart, everything from taxation of high-end plans to providing cuts in Medicare. But I think it's going to be very difficult to enact all of those offsets, and therefore difficult to keep health care reform deficit neutral as the president has suggested. Right now, they're on track to do it, but a lot could happen between now and the end of this health care game. More importantly, the main message I want to leave with you is this does nothing to tackle the very big long-term deficits that everybody else has talked about. In other words, all we're talking about right now is simply paying for any new costs. We're not paying for all of the liabilities that are out there that are not funded right now. So this does nothing to reduce the deficit. It just helps from it just keeps it from getting worse. That means that I think we're going to have to take several bites out of the apple. In other words, whatever we do this year, we're going to have to go on and do more next year or the year after or in future years. And we may have to eventually put caps on either national spending or federal spending, rather, on health care, or we may have to provide capitated payments to individuals that say you get so much for health insurance, and if you want any more than that, you pay for it out of your own pocket. We also could say to ourselves, well, health care is an enormously valuable thing. We've had tremendous advances in the medical care field. We're all living longer, and we're living a more healthy life in old age. The data are quite clear on that, and health care advances have had a lot to do with that. So most of us, me included, want those kinds of care options. So maybe we have to raise taxes to pay for the health care that we want. One way to do that would be to add a new source of revenue and earmark it for health care so that people would say to themselves, well, I'm willing to pay higher taxes because I know the money is going to go just to pay for health care, and I really value that. So there's quite a bit of discussion of doing something like that and using a value-added tax as the source of new revenue. Finally, what about tax reform? We desperately need tax reform. I think almost everybody agrees the current tax code is way too complex. It's somewhat unfair. It includes all kinds of special preference items that, by the way, are costing us $1 trillion a year in total. Let me say that again. The special preferences in the income tax code are costing us in lost revenue $1 trillion a year. So if we could get rid of even a quarter or a third of those special preferences, we could raise a lot of revenue. But that's going to be difficult. Everybody thinks their own preference. You think of the mortgage interest deduction. Most people don't want to give that up. And so they don't think of that as a preference. They think of that as just a legitimate thing to be able to deduct. So we may have to enact some new kind of tax. I already mentioned a value-added tax. Another idea is to tax energy, so we encourage conservation. Another new idea is to tax sweetened beverages, so we can deal with the problem of obesity in our society. So there are various tax changes that could be made that would kill several birds with one stone, raise some revenue, but also discourage some things that we don't want, and make the tax system fairer, simpler, and more economically efficient, because it wouldn't distort decision-making as much as it does now as people change their behavior to qualify for various kinds of special preferences. So my conclusion here is that we have a big problem. Our political leaders are not courageous enough to address it so far, but with more public education, more forums like this, we're hopeful that eventually it will be addressed and that people will understand that we all have to sacrifice a little bit. We all have to tighten our belts to prevent the kind of doomsday scenario that others have shown you. Thank you very much.
I guess it's time for your questions. So do we have roving mics? Is that how we're going to do it?
I wish there was one more dimension to your presentation tonight, and that was that you would present us with specific options with a price label. If we increase Social Security, the age of retirement, what would it save? If we got rid of the mortgage tax preference, how much would it save? How would we in the audience like to vote on that? And as you do your tour, that you gather evidence saying it seems to be what people are most willing to do is the following by the results we're gathering from the tour.
Well, I think you make a good point. There's a certain level of detail that you can go into in the limited amount of time. It's important for you to understand that this afternoon, the students did end up engaging in an exercise where there were specific options with specific price tags, but it took a considerable amount of time to be able to go through and do that. I think the other thing you have to keep in mind is, in order for that to be meaningful, it's got to be a statistically valid representative sample of citizens. Because otherwise, it just says this is what the group that came thought, rather than what a cross-section of Americans think. And that's one of the things that we need to do. We need to have much different citizen education engagement efforts that involve more representative samples of the population, and hopefully that's one of the things that we'll do going forward.
Let me just say, one of the things that we're going to do at Concord, this microphone, is this still on? With the help of the Peterson Foundation, is that exactly that sort of thing, because we've been doing this Fiscal Wake-Up Tour for 4 years, and we feel that people are awake. And what we need to do now is have sort of a fiscal solutions presentation. And, we've been working with a group called Viewpoint Learning, and then there are others that are like that do public opinion on these things. And what Dave said is very important, that if you're going to publish something or report results, you'd have to have some sort of statistically valid sample, which is something we've been doing as part of we call it a fiscal stewardship project, where we've been working in various cities around the country, and we've done several of these day-long dialogues where people actually go through some of these things and work together on what they would like to do. And we'll be publishing those results in December when we finish up the fiscal stewardship project. And some of them aren't quite as precise as you mentioned, because these choices are difficult. The other thing I would say is, with Social Security, it's very easy to get those sort of defined options, scored options they call them. And with taxes, it's relatively simple to do that. Some of them are easy with health care. Some of them are very difficult because the Congressional Budget Office has had a heck of a time scoring some of the options because there really isn't a lot of data about, and you have to make so many assumptions about behavior. So some categories fit better than that than others, but I think that's a really good idea.
Good question.
On medical costs, I'm wondering why we're not addressing in more depth things like tort reform, insurance competition across state lines, a study of best practice, the issue of maybe more co-pays so people don't abuse the system, the illegal immigration issue. I think we can really get costs down some by attacking a bunch of these issues.
Well, clearly the number one problem with healthcare is cost. And you're going to have to make some really tough choices in order to really control cost. You could start off with insurance reform and talk about what can be done to allow different pooling options other than employers. For example, why can't professional associations, trade associations, other type of groups create pools? What about the ability to offer insurance across state lines? There's also legitimate issues with regard to pre-existing conditions and certain and enhanced portability of plans. But I think in tort reform, the real cost of malpractice is not the issue of the awards, although that is an issue. It's defensive medicine. It's the fact that people end up doing a lot of things in order to avoid litigation. Personally, I think we ought to have special health care courts. I don't think we ought to have jury trials for health care. We ought to have special health care courts like we do for the bankruptcy. But in addition to that, if we move to evidence-based medicine, where we ended up changing our payment systems and to where we go more on evidence-based practices, that also would help quite a bit in cutting down on malpractice, because it would be a safe harbor that if you practice in accordance with this, then it would be a safe harbor, if you will. So, in the end, we're going to have to change our payment systems. We're going to end up having to change our tax preferences. We're going to have to end up changing our premium subsidies under Medicare for middle and upper income individuals. We're going to have to do all that and more. And the question is, why aren't we doing that first?
you address your expectations for inflation in years coming ahead? A year ago, gas was $5 a gallon. Some of the oil-producing countries have said they'd rather maybe have something other than dollars. Since we're borrowing so much and printing so much, what can we expect in that arena? Who wants to go first?
I'm not at all worried about inflation right now. And the simple reason is because the economy is so depressed. And there's lots of excess capacity. There's excess capacity of labor. That's why we have almost 10% unemployed. There's lots of excess capacity in our plant and equipment as well. So we aren't, and no good economist I know is expecting inflation anytime soon. I think what people are worried about is that as we recover, given all of the assets that the Federal Reserve has purchased in recent years, that they will have to unwind the money that they put out there into the system, and that's going to be a difficult task for them. And we could get some inflation if they don't handle it well. I happen to have quite a lot of confidence in the Fed and think that's not a big problem. The other fear people have is that if we don't make any of these tough choices that we've all talked about, and we just keep borrowing to a fare-thee well, at some point we will monetize our debt, as some other countries have done. I am fairly optimistic that we won't do that either, but you're right, that's a concern.
Could you maybe change the time frame towards recovery? Because I don't want to stay in recession forever, and that was the time frame I was addressing. As it gets better, people will consume more, and prices would get bid.
Well, a lot of people are saying we won't be back to full employment until 2015. I mean, so I don't know what your time frame is, and nobody can forecast the economy. I hope that we can make a more rapid recovery than that, but it's not looking right now as if we will.
Well, an increasing number of people are arguing that technically we may be out of the recession by the end of this year. But my personal view is that we're going to see somewhat less consumer consumption, somewhat higher savings rates among consumers, somewhat less debt-financed consumption among consumers, and therefore that means that when we get recovery, we're going to have a somewhat lower economic growth rate than historically may have been the case, but maybe more sustainable. I also think that, if you look at monetary policy, it's inflationary unless you're able to turn it. And I have a lot, frankly, higher confidence in the Fed's ability to unwind than I do the Congress and the executive branch, because there's two things that stoke the inflation. There's monetary policy and there's fiscal policy. My greater fear, frankly, is not the inflation issue, although I do think there are inflationary pressures. It's interest rates. Because if foreign lenders lose confidence in our ability to put our financial house in order, even though they may not be that worried about default, because I don't think we'll ever default, they would be worried about what is the dollar going to be worth that they're going to get repaid in, and therefore they charge higher interest rates because of that risk premium. And that's what I'm worried about. And I think that's a very real risk.
Yeah, that's a third source of inflation that we ought to peg here. If the value of the dollar plummets, that increases the price of everything we import, and that can create a kind of what's called, economists call cost-push inflation, and we could get some of that.
A question over there. My question is to Robert Bixby on your chart on the major fiscal exposures, and you do not include the Medicaid on there. And as I understand, we haven't even figured out what that is, but dimensionally it could be in a range of $44 billion. So if you add that on there, we're talking about a $300 trillion, or about 300,000 plus per individual, or 5 to 7 times the income. Is that correct?
I think you may be looking at one of Dave's charts. That's the fiscal exposures. Yes, that's
yeah, it may have been one of mine. Well, first you understand that with regard to the projection of expenditures, Medicaid's in there. So if you look at the one where I did the graphic that has the line and then the bars. Medicaid is in there. Medicaid is not in the one that talks about the liabilities and unfunded promises, because the nature of the Medicaid program, Medicaid, is fundamentally different. In the case of Social Security and Medicare, there is a legal promise to provide a certain level of benefit or a certain level of coverage. That's not the case for Medicaid. Medicaid doesn't have the same kind of promise. It is mandatory spending, and it is a problem, and it's going to be an even bigger problem as we have an aging society because of long-term care costs, but that's why it's not in there, because the nature of the promise is fundamentally different. It's a huge problem, and it's the number one problem for states. The number one fiscal problem for states is Medicaid. Well, let's put it this way. We can make them bigger. It's bad no matter what. Yeah, here's the key. When are we going to start doing something about it? That's the real question. That's the real question. About $1 trillion. About $1 trillion. That's right. And the number one tax preference in the Internal Revenue Code is the fact that very few Americans pay income tax or payroll taxes on the value of employer-provided and paid health care. $288 billion a year. Now let's think about that for a second. That means that if you're a CEO for a top company with very lucrative health care plan, probably better than rank and file, highest marginal tax rates, the taxpayers subsidize your health care big time. On the other hand, if you're working in small business, near poor, not eligible for Medicaid, you don't have any kind of health care plan at all from your employer, you get Shinola. All right? That makes no sense.
I want to add because I think you raise a really good point on the two big programs, Medicare and Social Security, that's worth elaborating a little bit on, because I think a lot of people, because we pay a payroll tax, a dedicated payroll tax for those two programs, people, I think, make the logical assumption that they are self-financing. Now, that has been true with Social Security. It is, I think, is well understood in this audience, I'm sure, been taking in more than it needs to pay current beneficiaries. There's been a Social Security surplus. The government has spent the money on other things. We have a Social Security trust fund. But in terms of cash flows, Social Security has more than paid for itself over the past 20 or 30 years. The problem there is going forward. We're right at a situation now where the incoming payroll tax just about covers the benefits that have to be paid. It's just about even. It's about to turn negative in a few years. Yeah, next year. If you take just the payroll tax, there's, for some technical reasons, taxation of benefits you add in. But I mean, if you're just looking at the payroll tax, it turns negative next year. So from that point on, the rest of the federal budget will have to start paying back the bonds in the trust fund. So the Treasury is going to have to get that money from somewhere, either by borrowing the money from China or raising taxes or cutting other programs. Now, with Medicare, the situation is a lot worse. Medicare Part A, which is the part funded by the payroll tax, is already running a cash deficit, and has for the last few years. But the bigger part to focus on is Part B and Part D, which is the new prescription drug benefit. Those people pay a premium. It's deducted mostly from the Social Security check. So people have an idea, too, that those premiums cover the cost of the programs. But they don't. The premiums are designed to only cover about 25% of the cost of the program. So you add it all together, and a large portion, nearing 50%, still under 50%, but somewhere in the 40s, of the Medicare program is actually funded by general revenues. So when we think about the future of these two programs, we have to think about, and why they're going to have such an effect on the federal budget, is because they're not, particularly going forward in the future, self-financing, and the Treasury is going to have to find ways. It's going to have a big impact on the rest of the federal budget.
Bob, quick comment on that. Keep in mind, Part B, which is supplemental medical insurance, physicians and outpayments for Medicare. Part D, prescription drug assistance. On average, the premium pays 25% of the cost. Who's paying the other 75%? Kids and grandkids with interest. Now that might make sense for somebody who's near poor to have a 75% subsidy. But for any of us, or my boss, who's a billionaire, makes no sense whatsoever. But that's our system.
Phil?
Hi. I wanted to ask, you mentioned that quite a bit that this is a moral issue, speaking of our next generation and whatnot. So taking a step back, what do you think about the idea of making balanced budgets mandatory in some fashion, either constitutionally or whatnot, as a moral issue?
Well, the Concord Coalition endorsed the balanced budget amendment several years ago in the 1990s, and we did so. Our co-chairman Warren Rudman observed at the time that this is a bad idea whose time has come, and we used to say that you really needed some sort of backup like that of that level as a constitutional nature in order to get the budget in shape. Subsequent events somewhat proved that theory wrong, because as a matter of fact, budget deficits came down consistently from 1992 all the way through 2000 and then began to go up again. We actually had surpluses for a couple of years, and then began to go up again and suddenly in the dramatic fashion that they have now. I think we need tougher budget controls, but I don't think a strict balanced budget amendment written into the Constitution is a good idea, because you have things like this year where you have an enormous budget, where you have an enormous recession, and I think the federal government does need to have the flexibility to be able to deal with that. But there might be some other ideas, I know, on the panel on how that might happen. Dave?
I would not be in favor of having something like that in the Constitution. I think we should be very careful about adding provisions like that to the Constitution. But I do think it would be sensible to add some budget process controls that are statutory, but short of constitutional. During the 1990s, we had some statutory rules that any increase in benefits or any reduction in taxes had to be paid for, had to be offset. It was called pay-go. We also had caps on how much money could be annually appropriated in different categories. I was in the budget office during the Clinton administration when those rules, statutorily based rules, were in effect, and it helped a great deal in terms of our ability to get the deficits that we began with in 1992 under control by the end of the 1990s and actually run surpluses. And the way it works is politically, you have all kinds of groups and claimants out there constantly knocking on your door and saying, we need more benefits, or we need tax cuts or tax preferences of various kinds. And you can sort of say, gee, we'd love to help you, but we can't, because Congress has passed this law that says that everything we do has to be paid for. You tell us where else you want to cut or how you're going to pay for it, and maybe we'll consider your request. So it gives a lot of cover or a lot of help to any administration and to Congress to have those kinds of rules in place. Right now, there's been talk about it. There are some rules, but they are not being applied in the way they were in the 1990s. And in fact, a whole lot of things are being done right now that are simply going to make the deficit worse because they're not being paid for.
I agree that we need statutory budget controls, tougher than the ones we had in the 90s. I don't think that we need a balanced budget amendment per year, because I think what you need is a balanced budget over an economic cycle, all right? What I do think is we do need a constitutional amendment that would limit how much debt as a percentage of the economy we can have. We need a credit card limit. We have a credit card limit now. We just don't know what it is because the Chinese haven't told us yet.
Over on this side.
I have a question that's related more to the people aspect of this problem, specifically Congress and us in electing them. My personal opinion, I'm very pessimistic. I personally don't think that, my personal opinion is that there's not more than 5 or 10 people in Congress who are serious about this problem, which means that we are electing 525 people who are not serious about this problem. Is there, we won't solve the problem ourselves. We can only solve it by voting for the people who will get in a room and solve the problem. Is there a way that in this upcoming election we can understand who are the candidates, who are the incumbents who are serious without grading on a curve? If they all get an F, then give them an F. Who are the candidates who are serious? Who are the challengers who are serious?
We at the Peterson Foundation are looking very seriously at funding an effort that would provide more transparency on which members of Congress, Senate and House, are more fiscally responsible than others based upon their actual votes. From a practical standpoint, it would be nice to be able to do it for challengers. The problem is you don't have the record. And so the only way you can really do it is for people who are in office and actually how they vote on issues that have fiscal consequence. We clearly need more transparency and accountability here. But frankly, in addition to a constitutional amendment for how much debt is a percentage of GDP, we need some political constitutional amendments too, because we have a dysfunctional democracy. And we need to think about making changes with regard to how we redistrict in the House, campaign finance, as well as term limits.
And I would add that a lot of the scary numbers that we've presented, members of Congress know this. They're aware of the problems we face. But quite honestly, I don't really think they trust you, the voters, to be able to handle this. When I talk to lawmakers, they say, well, if I proposed raising taxes or if I proposed cutting spending, the voters would have a temper tantrum and throw me out of office. And so in a sad way, they kind of see their voters as not willing to make the difficult decisions. They kind of see you as children who would throw a temper tantrum if you were told this. And so I think it's important to communicate to them, you're adults, we're all adults, we can handle this discussion without throwing a fit. We understand that the current situation is not tenable. And part of it, if you want to find out how a lawmaker stands, go to a town hall meeting and ask him or her exactly how would you balance the budget. And the first thing your lawmaker will do is say, well, I think it's very important that we balance the budget, and I think America has a lot of challenges, and I think we should address them all. And then you say, nope, not good enough. I want specifics. And if you keep pushing them, you can keep following up, you can kind of pin them down. And the other benefit of going to a town hall is it scares them. Because there's a kind of a rule of thumb in Congress that for every one person who's sufficiently motivated to go to a town hall, there's 20 people who are angry but couldn't make it to a town hall. So if 10 people go to a town hall, they're going to come back into Washington and go, everybody in my district is furious about not balancing the budget. So you can have some fun scaring them.
I just want to add to that, because we've done a lot of these things, and two quick stories. One is every election cycle we do at the Concord Coalition called Key Questions that voters should ask the candidates. So we'll be updating that for the 2010 cycle, and that's a good thing to bring to ask people questions. The other one is we used to have a scorecard for members of Congress, and we did that for a number of years. We discontinued it a while back because we couldn't find sufficient votes regarding fiscal responsibility that we could use to appropriately score people.
How about fiscal irresponsibility?
Well, I mean, there were irresponsible votes, but they were all just like party line things, like people would bring up a rah-rah vote, and we finally said this is not credible. We can't analyze these votes because they're not meant to be serious, and there are not enough of them where they're actually doing things. So that is the and how do you score something like when somebody votes votes against the prescription drug benefit, not because it was unpaid for or too big, but because it was not big enough. So is that a fiscally responsible vote? So, I mean, you can't get into people's heads that way. But, I mean, those are the kind of challenges that we face. I think we need
if I could just add one more point on this. The other thing, in addition to what Brian said about the elected officials not thinking that you will support their doing tough things, they also think you're not informed enough. So, you know, I'm a big supporter of President Obama, but what did he do about fiscal responsibility earlier this year? He said to his cabinet, please find $100 million worth of cuts. And that was in all the press. And that was meant to show that he was a fiscally responsible president. Now, going to your first question, if you don't know anything about these numbers, if you don't know the difference between 100 million and 100 billion, much less a trillion, then you're going to be taken in by some newspaper story that says the President of the United States has asked his cabinet to cut 100 million. So you do have to have some education in this arena.
Just to follow up on that, $100 million would pay the interest on the stimulus bill, not the budget, but the stimulus bill alone for 6 hours.
$100 million is a little over 30 minutes worth of deficit. 30 minutes worth of deficit. We're running deficits $3.8 billion a day.
Oh, you're all a bunch of gloom and doom people. Over here. Over here.
It's great how many hands are up.
There was a question about immigration that wasn't answered. And my question is, with our demographic and our aging population, is immigration a net positive or negative on our economy?
It depends upon the quality of the immigration. Basically what it comes down to is if your immigration policy results in improving the average skills and knowledge level of the population such that they're going to contribute more than they take, it's a net plus. If, on the other hand, it's a below average with regard to skills and knowledge, it's a minus.
I would add to this that right now the studies show that at the national or federal level it's a plus because they don't get very many federal benefits, but they do pay Social Security taxes. So that's a plus. At the state or local level it tends to be a minus because at that level they're getting public education and some health care and some social services that go the other way around. All the Social Security revenue goes to the federal government.
We got several hands up. Oh, we got a gentleman in the back.
We on? Thank you. This is very cogent. I guess I have sort of a two-part question, and it has to do with citizen logic. And logic usually doesn't work in bureaucracies or federal government. I see in the paper where we're trying to cut the incomes of the CEOs, and that's certainly admirable. However, when the FDIC bails out a bank, like New Frontier Bank, which was in our paper this morning, but we still have the 7th Colorado Dairy filing Chapter 11. We have one part of the system that works and the other part that leaves the poor consumer who is borrowing at the bank out in the cold and out of business. So we're not really servicing both ends. I'm going to assume that these are the brightest minds in the room for the evening. And obviously you've shown us with your statistics that that's true. However, history shows us that the brightest minds in the room are always listened to last rather than first, and they cite history. Then you have to deal. There we go. Then you have to deal with congressional leaders. Then you've got the federal generated fiscal policy, which is somewhat intractable, and then you've got the bureaucratic time that it takes to implement all the things that you're talking about, and we're trying to help you, versus very little entrepreneurial-based business sensibility that resides in our congressional leaders. versus a highly fractured thinking citizenry who are awake now. We are awake, we are listening, and we're just trying to survive, and we're also trying to put our kids through DU for the next generation. And we've got too many issues to keep up with, which also divides us. So I think deferring to the first person who spoke to you tonight or asked a question was, I think the public needs a process, a strategy, a list of consistent and detailed talking points that they can constantly bring up, which is only really the way to find the takeoff runway rather than taxiing looking for the runway. Thank you.
Well, one of the things is everybody here, I think, received a citizen's guide to the State of the Union's finances. And in that citizen's guide, I think there's a number of questions right in it that you can ask. And I think, Concord probably has some. We at the Peterson Foundation have some. And so please use some of the material that you've provided. I think it'll help you.
I think also, I shouldn't say this, but are there sign-up sheets here that we have? So there are sign-up sheets for anybody that would like information from any of the organizations represented here to keep informed. Phil, you've got this.
Well, you've all done an excellent job this evening of describing the problems we're facing. But in the interest of full disclosure, I should mention that I'm running for Congress in 2010 from the second District of Colorado. Name's Curtis Harris. And my question is, I think we're missing a fundamental issue here, and that is, I'd just like to ask the audience and the panel if anyone believes that the Congress, as it is presently constituted and as it presently functions, has any hope of dealing constructively with these problems. Now, obviously, I think that's a rhetorical question, but I would argue that the Congress is arrogant, out of touch, and doesn't have a clue how to get themselves out of the corner that they've painted themselves into.
I think right now they're definitely not prepared to handle this in any way. I mean, which is why you're not seeing any activity. It's not really even on the agenda. But their hand is going to be forced at some point. You cannot keep running trillion-dollar budget deficits and find people willing to buy that level of debt and allow the economy to continue to function. At some point, something's got to give. What may happen is the bond market may go into a panic and start raising interest rates. And at that point, what seems politically impossible today becomes politically possible by necessity. And so you're right that they're not capable today, but what we're trying to do is lay the groundwork, because democracies usually respond to a crisis. And a crisis will happen at some point. And the sad reality is we can't get them to respond before a crisis. I mean, we didn't take terrorism seriously until 9/11. We didn't take the levee seriously until Katrina. We didn't take bridges seriously until the Minnesota collapse. So what we're trying to do is get them focused before then. But I should also mention, there is actually a bill in Congress right now that we're trying to put forward that would create an entitlement commission or a long-term commission that would create legislation that Congress would be required to vote on to address this. So it's not a commission that would do a little report that would go on a shelf somewhere and make a nice doorstep when you visit your member of Congress, but it would actually force Congress to put a bill on the floor and force them to vote for it, which is something right now they're not even willing to do that, to take those votes. So there is talk of at least getting it going, but you're right, usually you need a crisis.
Well, yeah, I think the bottom line is, I think we need policy reforms, operational reforms, and political reforms. I think if the founders came back today, one of the things that they would be very disappointed at is that unlike at the founding of the Republic, where people came out of the real world with real jobs for a short or medium period of time, did public service, and then return to the real world in their real jobs, we now have something called career politicians. That redistricting, which is gerrymandered districts, done for partisan political purposes and to entrench incumbents, combined with campaign finance rules, combined with no term limits, gives us a dysfunctional democracy. And that's got to change.
Jeff? Okay. Back there, and then we have a lot of hands up on this subject.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's 3 words I haven't heard from any of the panelists tonight by way of a solution, and I'm wondering why. And those 3 words are raise corporate taxes.
I can jump.
Okay.
You want to take the
You want to start first?
I'll
Go
start.
ahead.
Well, first off, the corporate income tax this year took in $150 billion. Granted, because there was no corporate profits to tax. In a regular year, it would take in about $300 billion. So if you doubled the corporate tax from, say, 35% to 70%, and you just used a crude assumption that it wouldn't affect the economy, you still wouldn't close a quarter of the budget deficit. There's not enough money there. But it's also important to note that corporations, for the most part, don't pay taxes. They pass taxes down onto consumers, onto shareholders, through higher prices
and wages
and lower wages. And so, and the corporate taxes also can erode our competitiveness. And so, A, you can't get that much money from it, and B, there would be a lot of economic consequences that would actually come right back into our faces through our wages, through prices, through our 401ks dropping. It's a tough thing to do.
Jeff, did you? Oh, Phil's going on. There's a lot of folks on this section.
Yeah, I have one question. And the largest employer in this country is the United States government. They employ more than anyone. They don't pay into the Social Security. All of us do.
They do now.
They do now.
They do now.
So maybe that will help shore it up. But that's my main concern. We keep growing government, and we don't grow the private sector. So they are telling us to cut our belts, pull them in, but they're not. They're not pulling in anything. And I don't understand that. How can you got to lead by example, and they have not led by example. Not one step of the way.
Well, a couple things. One, there is a serious problem, I believe, and growing concern among the public with regard to the disconnect between public sector, not just federal government, also state and local, public sector pay and benefits, and private sector pay and benefits, especially given the fact that there's a lot more job security in government than there is the private sector. Benefit programs in the public sector typically are very generous. Very generous. And I'll give you an example of something that I thought was particularly outrageous that is being talked about in Washington right now. You know, there's something called sick pay. I always thought you were supposed to use sick days when you're sick. I don't know, maybe I'm old-fashioned. I thought that's what it was supposed to be, right? In full and fair disclosure, I've been working now, for 36, 37 years, and I haven't had 5 sick days in my life, right? There's a bill in Congress now so that federal government employees can end up taking unused sick days and adding it on to their pension. That is so out of touch with reality, but is indicative. The last thing I'll say is executive compensation is out of control. My personal view is I'm for pay-for-performance system, and if Congress was on a pay-for-performance system, they would owe money.
I'd like to kind of pick up on something the gentleman over here said and our congressional candidate here a little bit, in that it's hard for me not to think that our deficit is really kind of a reflection of kind of the values of our society, so to speak. I mean, we are very much living in a, we've increased our tolerance for debt. We're living for today instead of for tomorrow. We're pretty much telling our leaders to do what I say, not what I do. And clearly,
the discussion earlier was one of, I don't think anybody here has any confidence in our leaders to, for whatever reason, either can't or won't make the tough decisions until their pants are on fire. And one of the big comments that you made, Mr. Walker, is the importance of increasing the savings rate and such. But nothing that was among all the issues from the Peterson Foundation and everybody else addressed any of those kinds of activities. We've got a lot of discussion going on from a 30,000-foot level, and it needs to be done. We know what the problems are. Okay. But I guess my question is, do we really have kind of a chicken and egg situation in that, we can't expect the leaders to do things if they're not being done by the citizenry?
Well, we do have a cultural problem. From the beginning of the Republic in 1789 until about 30 years ago, this country didn't take on debt, didn't run deficits and take on debt unless we had a war, serious recession, or depression. Starting at that point in time, the country became addicted to debt. And many Americans started following the bad example of the federal government, spending more money than it made, charging the credit card, mortgaging the future. Now, we got control of things in the 90s at the federal level through the statutory budget controls that Bush 41 and Clinton, they deserve a lot of credit for that, put in place. Americans felt wealthier than they were because of increase in home equity prices. Credit became too loose. People got credit that never should have gotten credit, not only through housing, through credit cards and things of that nature. And we do have a cultural problem. There's absolutely no question about that. And it's going to be tough to change, but we must change because the future is based upon saving. Saving is the seed corn for the future. And while Americans are starting to save more, the government is dissaving faster than Americans are saving. That's got to change.
I think there is an opportunity. If you want to be optimistic about how bad the current situation is, I think one of the things that it's shocked people into doing is saving more. And I think particularly for younger people who are seeing what's happened on Wall Street. So, people, when we started out on the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour, people would ask things like, you have to paint you have to tell us what could happen. You have to show us what a crisis would look like. And now people, I think, have a better sense of what a crisis could look like. And so I think it's important. Now, Washington has bailed out a lot of companies, industries, and you can have a debate about whether it should have or shouldn't have. But the question hanging in the air is who bails out Washington. And I think, we can learn these lessons from what's happened over the past year, which is, one, don't become overly reliant on debt. You really can get into problems that way. And one way you can do it is hiding some of your debt off the books, which is what we do, as Dave has pointed out in some of his charts. And another one is don't rely on some rosy scenario to be able to pay all of your debts. Well, Washington does that too. And the other factor to take out of the Wall Street crisis is things can go very bad very fast. All of those things apply to the federal budget, and I think people can see through what the crisis that's hit on Wall Street can see that it could apply to the federal budget as well, and perhaps be more receptive to a message of why we need to get our federal fiscal house in order.
The truth is the factors that cause the mortgage-related subprime exist for the federal government's own finances. There's two big differences. Number one, the scale is much bigger for the federal government's finances. And number two, nobody's going to bail out America.
The only other comment that I would make is that clearly you and everybody else is admitting the significance of needing to affect something on the other end of the spectrum in terms of grassroots, the citizenry and such like that.
I'd certainly like to see more of that in your discussions and what you're talking about, because I like I said, I think it's a chicken and egg situation. I don't think we can expect politicians to solve a problem that clearly Americans are incapable, in a general sense, of handling on their own level.
pgpf.org, www.pgpf.org. Sign up on the Citizens Action. We'll never ask you for money. We'll protect your privacy, and we want to build a grassroots efforts around the country. That's what it's going to take. pgpf.org. Go there. That's our website. Go to the Citizen Action section. Sign up. We'll never ask you for money. We'll protect your privacy, but we've got to take back.
Now, see, Dave, you say we'll never ask you for money, and I'm trying to run a struggling nonprofit that. Okay.
I didn't say you wouldn't ask.
Yeah, that's right. He won't ask you for money, but I will. Go ahead.
Yes, you mentioned earlier about the complexity and the unfairness of the tax system as it is. I'm curious to know, if you were able to implement a simplified tax code now, what would it look like?
A progressive consumption tax. If we could just eliminate the whole thing and go to a progressive consumption tax, although politically, I don't think we'll ever get there. I think where we're headed is a more streamlined, more simplified, by that I mean streamlined, less tax preferences, less deductions, exemptions, credits, exclusions, broader-based income tax to keep rates as low as possible. We already talked about what would happen on the payroll tax, raise the taxable wage cap, but not the rate. And I think we're going to have some type of a consumption tax, probably a value-added tax, possibly dedicated to health care. That's where I think we're headed. But if you started from scratch, some type of progressive consumption tax that would encourage savings and that would make sure that everybody is paying something. Believe it or not, right now, 40% of Americans plus don't pay any income tax, headed to 50% plus, and guess what? Every constitutional function of the federal government is funded by the income tax. So that means 40%, soon to be 50% plus, get a free ride on the constitutional responsibilities of the federal government. That's a problem.
I agree with that.
Oh, go ahead.
I agree with that too. I think the ideal tax system would broaden the base, get rid of some of the dumb deductions, in exchange for lower rates. So you tax consumption once at maybe two marginal tax rates instead of having a whole bunch. Simplified, fewer distortions, like the $1 trillion in tax expenditures that Bell mentioned. Get rid of some of those, lower the rate, simplify it so that we can put some of the tax accountants out of business. No offense to the accountants.
I'm not a tax accountant, but I am a CPA.
Yeah.
I just want to say, I think on those little booklets, from the Peterson Foundation booklets, I think on the back they have the websites of all of the participating organizations. Next question was from...
What is your best guesstimate of where interest rates are starting? When will they start to go up? And what is your best guesstimate by how much?
That sounds like investment advice.
Actually, when myself and many other millions of Americans who made the right decisions over the past 5 years are suffering because of these low interest rates. So we sit here doing certain things, waiting for the interest rates to rise, and I'm just curious, when she speaks of no inflation, maybe not until when,
that's different than
which impacts it, plus many other factors that you know much better than I do. So what's your best estimate?
Well, first, I don't give investment advice. My view is that once we have clearly turned the corner on the economy, and once the economy starts growing, then demand will go up. And if we don't end up demonstrating to our foreign lenders that we're going to do something to try to put our financial house in order, in my view, 2010. We have to send a signal in 2010. It may be creating a process. You're not going to make all the decisions in 2010. You're just going to create a process that will lead towards the decisions being made. If the economy turns around and we don't create some type of a process, I think you'll start seeing interest rates go up next year. And then the question is, how high are they going to go?
I mean, it's very tough to estimate, although in terms of long-term interest rates, and over the long term, there's one rule of thumb that some economists use that say for every percentage point the debt to GDP ratio goes up, long-term interest rates go up 5 basis points. Now, if say the long...
0.05%.
Yeah, so say we go from 40% of the GDP to 100% of the GDP for the debt, which could happen in 10 years. That would be 60 percentage points. That would lead to about 3 percentage points in interest rates over that point. Now, that's just the effect from debt. That's not counting the effect if we have inflation in the next couple of years from all the money the Federal Reserve pumped into the economy. One of the ways in which they're going to take it out is with higher interest rates. So you have a couple things going on. You have debt causing interest rates to go up, and you have all the money the Federal Reserve's pumped in eventually causing interest rates to go up when we take it out. Now, these are rules of thumb, so there's a margin of error of plus or minus infinity, pretty much. But I thought I'd throw those out if they're helpful.
If I can get in on this, I would be much less pessimistic about interest rates going up anytime soon for the following reasons. First of all, Americans are saving a lot more than they were before. Those savings contribute to holding down interest rates. Secondly, all of the savings that's being done in other countries, particularly in China, which saves about half of their income, has to go somewhere. And there aren't any other great places for it to go right now. We may not have a strong economy here at the moment, but neither does anybody else around the world, no other advanced country. So it's going to be, I think, a while. I wouldn't count on these interest rates going up anytime real soon. They will go up eventually, though, in my view.
So refinance now.
You all have had really good information, and my biggest surprise is you've been doing this for 4 years. All of us have been talking about this for 4 years, and yet Washington remains doing the same old thing. We elect new people, and they do the same thing that the old people did. What can we do to change it? And then the other thing you mentioned was older people will need to work longer. We'll get an employer to keep us longer because they want young people. So don't put it on the old people, it's our fault, because it isn't.
Sympathetic with that.
Well, employers are going to have to keep people longer, and we need them to keep people longer, and people are going to have to work longer. They're a lag indicator. Look, Washington is the biggest lag indicator. Many employers are lag indicators too. But when you look at the numbers on workforce growth and life expectancy and the nature of the economy being a more service-based economy than a manual labor-based economy, all the trends tell you that it may be a while before employers wake up, but the simple fact of the matter is this country and eventually employers are going to need people to work longer. And they're slow getting the message, and we're in a recession right now, so that's not the time that they're going to become enlightened, okay? But eventually they will.
Phil, you get this gentleman in the front row.
I assume from all of your references to health care that you were including Medicare and Medicaid only.
Mm-hmm.
The current administration and the current Congress are both talking about assuming control of all of the private health also. Now, based on your projections, which only included Medicaid and Medicare, what will that do to your projections?
Well, the current health care bills right now will... Sorry?
They don't take over all the private health care systems.
Well, right. Well, regardless of what they do, the current health care bills will certainly increase costs for federal costs. Right now, we're looking at something like $900 billion over 10 years, I think, is the Baucus bill, is the increase in costs. That comes, and considering the fact that it's really not fully implemented until about the 5th year, the per year cost is going to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, under the current bill, about half of that is offset in Medicare and Medicaid reductions in certain areas. My concern is in the past when Congress has implemented some of these reductions, they didn't actually have the guts to see them through, and they reversed them shortly thereafter. The other half comes from raising taxes in a lot of other areas, such as taxing the Cadillac health plans, taxing the most expensive health plans. And they will tax my Mountain Dew over my cold, dead body.
If it was diet, he'd be okay.
Yeah.
That may be okay with them, Brian.
But, so my concern is, you're right, is with the healthcare plan is you are increasing spending by hundreds of billions of dollars per year. And I have concerns that if you're going to raise taxes and you're going to trim Medicare and Medicaid, why not put the savings towards reducing the long-term deficit? Don't put the savings into creating a new entitlement. Because when we do go to cut the long-term deficit, that's two good options that we no longer have. And so now we have to cut deeper elsewhere and raise taxes more elsewhere because we've already used those reforms, even if we see them through, which isn't a given. We've already used those reforms to expand government even more. And you're right, they're going to be expensive bills, hundreds of billions of dollars per year.
I agree with the cost, but I think we do need to get a little clearer about what these reform bills do. They do not represent a government takeover of the healthcare system. Roughly hear me out. I'm just telling you a few facts. About 2/3 of the American public is covered by an employer-based health insurance plan. That's not government. I mean, if you think your employer is the government, well, then you can disagree with me. But if you work for a private employer and you get your health care through your private employer, which 2/3 of Americans do, that's not going to be taken over by the government. Those people who have employer-based health insurance are not going to be, even if we end up having a so-called public option, which is a big debate in Washington now, and it's not clear whether we're going to get it, but even if we do, you're not going to be allowed to shift from your employer-based private health care policy to buy into the public option. You're not going to be allowed to do that.
Unless you get dropped.
Well, if you got dropped.
If your employer drops you.
But your employer pays a penalty if he drops you.
Yeah.
Your employer, there are penalties for employers trying to do that.
Who are you talking about? Who are you talking to? Not me. I didn't say anything.
No, I wasn't talking to you. I was talking to Brian.
Oh, okay.
Bell and I have some differences on health policy, I think.
Well, but this is factual, Brian.
Although I would say that there is a danger. There are differing amounts on whether or not people would be dropped from their employer. If the employer decides that, like if there's a public option, if the employer decides that it's just better off to pay the penalty than to deal with all of the government headaches.
I think we're kind of getting in the weeds.
But that's kind of...
I think we're kind of getting in the weeds. Let me give you a bottom line, okay? We've already promised $38 trillion more than we have funds for Medicare. All right? Washington likes to give everybody dessert and not ever be able to have people eat the spinach. All right? That's what's happening again. And fiscally responsible healthcare reform, in my view, should meet 4 tests. And I think the odds of them meeting these tests are next to nothing. Number 1, it has to pay for the expansion over 10 years. Number 2, it has to not add to deficits beyond 10 years. Number 3, it has to reduce total health care costs as a percentage of the economy, total, not just federal, as compared to doing nothing. And number 4, it needs to significantly reduce the $38 trillion in unfunded obligations. All 4. If it doesn't do all 4, it's not fiscally responsible. And we'll see.
I would just add that, whether they suppose there were a government takeover of healthcare. I happen to agree with Bill that that's not a description of what's actually on the table, but suppose it was, and your question was, what would that do to the charts? Well, it would depend on whether or not they deficit financed it or paid for it. And I guess my thinking would be that whatever they do with health care reform, it's only a minimum obligation to at least pay for it. Because as Dave said, you're going over a cliff, so if you're just paying for something new, you're not solving the long-term problem. And so evaluating whatever comes out of healthcare reform from a fiscal point of view is really important to find out whether or not. I mean, you could expand government's commitment and pay for it, and that would not change those projections, because those projections are based on debt and rising interest to pay that debt, and it all metastasizes over time. So one could imagine, if one wanted to, a big government solution that was paid for that might have other effects that people wouldn't like, but it wouldn't make the deficit situation worse. You could have a situation that would dramatically reduce the government's involvement, and that would help, get the and if so long as that was paid for, you'd be able to have a more sustainable future. So, just in terms of the sustainability of the total federal government commitment, a lot of it depends on whether or not you're really making savings. Somebody is standing up over there.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm not even quite sure where to start, because some of the topics that I would like to hear responded to haven't even been brought up. They've been skirted in the issues. I guess I have a question for the panel, and I'm going to follow up. I'm going to put you guys in the spot a little bit. Has anybody heard of John Williams' work, Shadow Government Statistics? Familiar with alternative government statistics that comes out from John Williams' organization? So, yeah, well, because you've been citing normal statistics on like CPI. There's nothing to worry about CPI. Inflation's really not an issue. Unemployment is really 9.5%, and the reality is the government has been massaging statistics over the last 15 or 20 years and changing these calculations, CPI being a perfect example. And what's concerning to me, if you really want to wake up America, you've got to tell America the truth of what's been happening. CPI, excluding food and energy, I mean, it's a bogus calculation. Unemployment is not 9.5%. It's more like 16 or 17% in today's, on a apples-to-apples basis between now and the 80s. And you guys have alluded to this on several occasions, and I think, Brian, you were saying this. The only way that the politicians in this country are going to wake up is what, gosh, I can't think of the guy's name, is a black swan type of event. And what's happening in our culture right now, what's happening on a global basis right now that nobody's acknowledging is the U.S. dollar is losing the currency reserve status in the world. There's been lots of stories that come out from a potential pan currency in the Middle East, the Chinese divesting themselves from their U.S. dollar holdings, the Chinese delegation that was in Washington last summer that nobody wants to admit that was in there, that gave our politicians a message. And the reality is there is so much going on that is not being talked about in the mainstream media right now that is affecting our lives and will have a dramatic effect on our lives, that the only thing that's going to come down to is it's going to be probably a currency crisis, a loss of confidence in the dollar, a sell-off in the bond market, an extreme spike in inflation that's going to cause. I'm extremely pessimistic, and it's concerning. I guess it's concerning to me to hear you guys quote official statistics on, no concern about CPI. Does anybody recognize the fact that inflation is now driven by import prices much more so than wage prices back in the late 70s? So this is a lot throwing out. I guess I'm an average citizen. I've got 3 daughters too, Mr. Walker. Or you have two. Sorry, you had two. Two boys, 2 girls and a boy. I mean, I'm concerned about the future, but I just don't have any hope. I mean, I don't have any hope in Washington, and unfortunately, I think the only thing that's going to wake up this country is a collapse. And I would like you guys to respond to that. How can we avoid a collapse that may be here next month or next year or 2 or 3 years from now without dramatic reform across the spectrum? It has to start in Washington. It has to start.
I don't think the U.S. dollar is going to lose its reserve status, but I do think our market share is going to decline, and potentially significantly. We can reverse that if we do some, and we can avoid a crisis, and we can, if we do some of the things that we've talked about tonight. And frankly, my view is that for it to happen, the first 3 words in the Constitution have to come alive. Does anybody know what they are? All right. They have to come alive, and there has to be an extraordinary process like this Fiscal Future Commission that will tell people the truth, talk about the tough choices, set the table for a vote, members be required to vote on that. That's what it's going to take. The biggest risk that we face, you touched on, a loss of confidence in our ability to put our financial house in order, a dramatic decline in the dollar, significant increase in interest rates. That would cause a crisis that we don't want to see. It wouldn't start with an R, it would start with a D.
Right. Well, and my point is, I think if you look for the evidence, you'll see that confidence is being lost right now as we speak, and there is a lot of signs.
Yeah, and a lot of people, I and others are talking about that. I mean, I've met with the Premier of China twice at his request, and I didn't say anything to him that I hadn't said publicly here, but it was they're smart people. Okay, there is some commonality of interest, all right? But in the end, while you can't dump the debt that you have, you can reduce your willingness to buy additional debt, or you can charge more or demand a higher interest rate for being able to do it, in large part because of your concern about a decline in the value of the dollar that you're going to get repaid in. So that's the major risk, I think.
How are we doing? Okay, we got one more question. Dean Caldwell, why don't you select?
That's too much responsibility.
Okay.
How about that gentleman in the white shirt?
I've been listening to this story for over 20 years. I've been writing my congressmen, my senators. I've been contributing money to organizations like the Concord Coalition. I've been doing everything I can to communicate my views consistent with what you've all been saying. It's obvious to me, after those 20 years, that I'm in an electoral minority, a very small minority, that cares a damn about this. So my question of you is, aside from voting for my friend Kurt Harris, isn't it not only in my economic self-interest, but also in the nation's self-interest for me to do things like buy gold, short the currency, sell inflation or buy inflation index bonds, invest my money in Switzerland, all for the purpose of causing this calamity to occur? And I say that very reluctantly. I don't like that idea, but I'm old enough to remember the late 1970s. And it took 15% interest rates and 15% inflation before the people in Washington got the message that they had a crisis on their hands. And what I'm suggesting is that crisis has to be brought about. And it's not only in my economic self-interest, but in the country's interest that I bring that about. Why am I wrong?
Well, without getting into investment advice, I will just give you, I will give you some facts. First, diversification is prudent. Hedging against, providing some hedge against currency is prudent. And the significant majority of my pension is backed by inflation indexed.
Well, I guess I'd say I liked it better when you were contributing to the Concord Coalition.
But I think at a more serious vein, I mean, I can sympathize with that, with the thought of, the only way you can get a crisis is to the only way you get a solution is to get a crisis. And yet I could never say that I think that people should go out and try to deliberately cause a crisis. I think that because you really don't know. I mean, one of the things about a crisis, you really don't know what's going to happen. You can't control it. And it is far better to take actions preemptorily now, politically difficult, that
because then there'll be our own control. I mean, we'll have some idea over what's going to happen if you act now rather than trying to provoke a crisis. Because with a crisis, anything can spin out of control. We talk about the dangers of having too much debt in foreign hands. Well, you could look at that logically and say it really isn't likely to cause a crisis. It's not in China's best interest for the U.S. dollar and the U.S. economy to tank because they're holding so much of our debt. But it could be that if for some reason they slowed down the rate of purchase, or maybe they wanted to send a signal or something like that, things can go wrong and it can begin to snowball. So, in other words, I don't think it's a good idea. I certainly could never endorse it to try to deliberately cause a crisis.
But isn't it true that the longer we delay it,
Sure. And sometimes when we talk about that it would be something that scared the heck out of people would be a really good idea. And maybe it'd have to do more than scare the heck out of them to be a really good idea. And I really do think there's an opportunity. We've had a very rough year. And I think it's going to be a long time coming back in the economy. And I think that it really does concentrate people's minds on it. And look, politicians aren't there yet. I don't think the public is there yet. That's why I'm, sort of come around to the point of view that some sort of a commission enacted now that would look at these things would get a good reception. Because I think there's a fundamental understanding that something does need to be done and that a crisis is lurking there. And people are sort of looking for an excuse to crawl back from the ledge and work together in a bipartisan way. Look, when we do these town hall meetings, a lot of times with members of Congress, there's an interesting dynamic. The members of Congress, as Brian has said, don't trust their constituents, and the constituents don't trust the congressman. So you're having a very dysfunctional conversation where, you'd want to put these little things up there that say, what he really meant was, you're a disingenuous idiot. And what the congressman really meant was, you're stupid, And so, I really think that if you get all of these issues out on the table, I think if a commission means that both sides can start talking to each other, and we try to facilitate those, like a good marriage counselor, we try to facilitate good conferences when we work with members of Congress. But that's the sort of thing that I think we have the opportunity to do now before we do get a crisis.
And also, you mentioned being an electoral minority. You are. Anybody, and the reason I say that is members of Congress tell me all day long I hear from people who want something from the government. People come into my office one after another. I want this. I want that. I want this. I want that. They say, I don't hear from people who tell me, I want you to spend less or to balance or to do what it takes to balance the budget. They don't hear that. And so what I would emphasize is, if you're a deficit hawk, don't just be a deficit hawk tonight. Remember, when you go into the voting booth, not to be the person who says, I want to cut the deficit. That's my second most important priority after increasing spending for X or after preserving Y. Because nobody wants a big deficit. Nobody walks around saying big deficit, yes. Reducing the deficit is everybody's second or third priority after deficit expanding policy that benefits me. So if you it's important to not be that person going into the lawmaker's office, always demanding more. And to remember this when you get into the voting booth.
I see that Mr. Harris has his hand up again, and I would like to ask him if he feels he can get elected on a specific agenda of deficit reduction actions, and if he has any ideas to share with us about that.
Way to put him on the spot.
First of all, just is this on? A response to what you said in terms of what we have in Congress.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Oh, no problem, no problem. But I want to say that what we have in Congress is politicians. We don't have leaders. These people don't have the courage to say no. They don't have the courage to educate us about what is right. And we need to change that. We need to send people to Congress who are going to make the tough calls, and that one of those people can be me. What would I do? It's honestly hard to say where you'd start in that mess. Number one, I'm running against a rich Democrat in a district that includes Boulder County. Okay? So I need help. Yeah. But on the second part of that is that I do think, I talk to young people all the time, and they are waking up. They are understanding what's being done to them, but again, they don't have leaders standing up to lead them to a solution. And that's what I'm going to offer.
Well, yeah, what are some specifics?
Which one of the things that we've talked about tonight do you like, and which one of the ones that you don't?
I like all the talk about tax reform. I don't like any of the talk about government health care. Basically what we have to do is stop talking about what else Congress and the government can do for us and start talking about what they're not going to do because we can't afford it.
Okay, but those are stop digging policies.
Exactly.
Those aren't actually close the problem. Those are problems solutions to not make it worse.
Right.
But how would you actually close the gap?
If I had the power to do it, I'd go back to the Constitution and identify all the parts of the federal government that are unconstitutional and eliminate them. There is no federal role in education. They've screwed up. Haven't they screwed up the public education system beyond repair? How many years back in the early 70s we created a Department of Energy to make us energy independent? How's that working? Not at all. And we're spending
of course, education
billions
and energy are both part of the discretionary part of the budget, which is about 17%. It isn't growing faster than the economy. So what about the entitlement programs?
About which program?
The entitlement program.
All the money in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid.
Yeah, we have to face the fact that we can't afford them. I mean, there have to be fundamental changes. We're whistling past the graveyard on these things. And most of us are either at or near retirement age.
Are you willing to raise the retirement age?
Before I did that, that would make me go back to work, so I can't do that. But, yeah, I think that the retirement age should be an individual choice. And it's up to you to develop the assets that allow you to retire when you're 50, or if you enjoy working, when you're 70. That's a personal choice.
But this is good. This is the kind of conversation we need to be having. This is a good exercise.
I'll help you out here. We really need to wrap this. I'll help you out here. Government policy needs to encourage people to work longer because we have slow workforce growth, we have longer lifespans, we have a knowledge-based, service-oriented economy, and by encouraging people to work longer, it's good for the country,
it is.
And in many cases it's good for the individuals to stay mentally and physically active. Yeah. However, that means that the retirement ages need to gradually increase and be indexed for life expectancy. But if you want to retire early, fine. But government policy shouldn't encourage you to retire early. Right now, it encourages people to retire too early.
Let me tell you what encouraged me to retire early. Basically, looking at family finances a few years ago, I said, why should I go ahead and work 40, 50 hours a week with the marginal tax rates with state and federal combined and all the other stuff taking almost half of my income? I don't need the money. I might as well retire. There is a disincentive to work.
Well, you ain't seen nothing yet because tax rates are going to double if we don't end up restructuring.
All right. I want to thank again Dean Caldwell, the University of Denver. Thank everybody for coming. We actually had a nice civil discussion here. We should do more of this.
Yes, thank all of you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Tell people to complete their evaluations.
Okay, there are evaluation forms on your seats, too, that we'd appreciate getting some feedback on. expenditures and deficits we run would eventually kill the economy. Obviously, helping the economy is I mean, we need, the stronger the economy, the easier